So, Bastian Grimm is the CEO and co-founder of PicAce and a renowned expert in large-scale international SEO, managing sites of almost any size and in highly competitive industries. With more than 20 years experience in online marketing, technical and global SEO, Bastian was named Search Personality of the Year at the 2019 European Search Awards. A welcome acknowledgement of his contribution to a rapidly evolving industry. He currently oversees both PicAce's search engine optimization and content marketing initiatives. Take it away, Bastian.
Thank you very much. So no pressure there. Yeah, it's gonna be slightly technical, obviously. I guess for those of you that have seen me speak somewhere else, I guess that's kind of the usual. Don't worry, I will share the slides afterwards, or you can just email us. Either way works. So we have a relatively packed 35 minutes. So try to stay in time. If we have to skip something to the end, then. Again, you get the slides, you can follow along. So yeah, crawling, indexing, crawl budget, index budget, and a lot of other somewhat technically tied together topics is what I brought for you today. But only a small bit, to be fair, a bit of theory in the beginning, and then try to be as hands-on as possible so that you guys can hopefully take a couple of things away from the talk as well. And yeah, so thanks for taking the time. Let's get straight into it. So I think if we start with the obvious, right? So Google doesn't crawl every page, neither of the web nor of your website. And if a page isn't crawled, obviously it won't be indexed either. I think this is relatively obvious. And you know, at the end of the day, if a page isn't indexed, it doesn't make you any money, right? So I think index management, page management, however you want to call it, is a very crucial topic. And I assume for those that have been doing this for a bit, this tweet popped up in early 2018. I'm sure you have seen that at some point, where John Mueller from Google said, well, you know what, like crawl budget is somewhat overrated and most sites don't really need to worry about it. It's an interesting topic, etc., which is probably even true, right? There's also this the new podcast that the Google guys launched a couple of months ago, actually last year, called Search of the Record. If you haven't listened to it, it's really worth taking some time to do that. They, and some topics go really deep, and in one of the episodes there was also crawling, crawl budget and those types of things has been kind of briefly discussed at least. And so Gary Illyes stated that, you know, if you have fewer than 1 million URLs on your website, you usually don't have to worry about crawl budget. It kind of goes somewhat into the same direction, even though I think multi-million and 1 million is already a slight difference. If you look into Webmaster Central's blog, it says essentially, without any limits, it says wasting server resources on pages will drain crawl activity away from pages, which may then cause a significant delay in discovering great content, right? So essentially it says, well, if you're not really taking care of what's being crawled and where your crawl budget is being allocated to, then you know some of your more important pages, they don't get the attention they deserve. Which is interesting, and I'm not sure if you have seen that. It just kind of happened a couple of weeks ago. Google actually released kind of their own guide on managing crawl budget. There was a topic that they never ever really discussed. So it's linked in the slide deck, and well, it says it's for enterprise sites, but if you look at, you know, a bit of how they specify that again, there's this large site thing with 1 million unique pages, but also there's another section that says, well, it could also be interesting for medium or larger sites with only 10,000 pages if they have somewhat a bit more kind of rapidly changing inventory. So all of a sudden, this 1 million doesn't seem to be that interesting anymore, but it's rather about what type of site you really have and what type of inventory you have and how that is all somewhat tied together. If you ever had to deal, and this is taken from one of our clients, if you ever had to deal with 50 million plus or more crawlable URLs, I guarantee you that, you know, dealing with URLs properly is in fact making a difference. If you compare that to analytics at the time, there was only 230,000 roughly URLs being reported, so it's a significant difference. And what usually happens when you look at larger sites, but not only larger sites, you find it almost any site, is that URL parameters, you know, if not taken care of, kind of cause this significant waste or the biggest problems, right? And that's something that you really need to be aware of, especially if you're working with, you know, ready-made systems that potentially not handling URLs really well. Then that is oftentimes what's causing those kind of, well, those bigger issues. This is a case that we've been working on a while ago, and what you can see on the chart, just on a very high level here, is that essentially if you manage to get Google to crawl important URLs, so what we ended up doing is just cutting down inventory, right? So we just removed URLs with in various ways, deleting them, redirecting them, etc., etc. What you can see here, though, is that when you start taking stuff away, the overall focus on really important stuff is actually something that's going to happen at some point in time. So if you kind of want to see where you stand, if you're not too deep into the topic, that's totally fine, don't worry. In Search Console, there's one section that's called the index coverage, or index coverage report, actually. There's a section it's highlighted on the left, kind of with excluded URLs, and then there's a whole bunch of reasons that you can find there, for various reasons, actually, when they are not processing or not indexing, or both, or there are crawl errors, etc. So this is a good starting point if you want a high-level entry and you're probably not familiar with dealing with log files, etc. This is something that you can utilize to see where you stand, right? And if you have something like this, only 4,000 valid URLs, but 21 million excluded ones, then in hindsight that actually means that Google is focusing probably 90-ish+% of time on URLs that are not really relevant for you and that don't make you any money. So that's essentially wasting a lot of their time and resources on something that you don't really care about. What's also new, in case you have missed that, they recently released, or they added a new report called crawl behavior. It's a bit weird for whatever reason. It's to be found in Search Console under settings, so it's not on the left hand in the regular report section, but you need to go into settings. But what you can do is you can drill down, you can see amount of crawl requests, you can see response types, but what's really interesting is you can also see requests by type of Googlebot. So is there essentially something going crazy when Google Ad Spot is hitting the site, etc. So this is something that is really also another great kind of addition to Search Console that can help a lot if you're not too familiar with dealing with log files, for example. Another topic I quickly want to address, we don't have that much time today, so I won't go deep into web performance, but it is actually, so this is another case that we've been working on in the past. That was a website that was actually really, really slow, so kind of Lighthouse score around 35, 36. We did some basic things really, so it wasn't great at the end because we just had limited time, but essentially if you look at it from a scoring perspective, kind of doubled the score, which kind of led to almost 25% of more URLs being crawled by Googlebot, right? So essentially, and this is something we need to talk about in a second, how does crawl budget actually work, and how can you deal with that? So yeah, web performance is a big part of actually getting more crawl time allocated to your website. So essentially what you can say, in my mind at least, kind of the bigger the site gets, right, the bigger the potential issues are that you might kind of be discovering. I think, so I was like, kind of, when I looked at it, was like, well, this 1 million URL rule or, whatever, is not really helpful. So in my mind, it's more about, what kind of trying to find the right approach for a website. And that's two things. So one is, of course, size, right? So if you're really dealing with only 1,000 URLs on a page, crawling most likely is not your biggest concern. Can be that indexing might be your concern. Again, if you have 1,000 URLs and you index 900 being duplicates, then that also doesn't really help. But essentially at the scale, you won't have crawling issues, potentially more indexing issues. On the other hand, I think what also is really interesting to understand is what type of domain or shop are we actually dealing with. So is that classifieds, which are usually by definition way bigger? Is that maybe e-com? So yeah, I think this is something that you also need to understand, kind of sector, or kind of essentially which quadrant are you in. A bit of a spoiler, I picked e-com. I think that's the thing that most of you are somewhat familiar with. So we're going to go into that. However, before we do that, I would quickly like you to walk you through kind of the concept of crawl budget, really, because I think this is something that's oftentimes quite misunderstood. So essentially, crawl budget is the length of a search engine's crawler that they are spending on your website, and what you want is them to spend it wisely, right? Because essentially crawling costs money, infrastructure-wise. Crawling should be and must be used efficiently, also from an economic perspective. And websites receive a specific crawl budget, depending on various factors, and we need to talk about those factors as well. But what it's not that they say, well, we crawl X documents per host. Rather, it is something like, you could imagine, data center computing time. which also makes sense if you look at it from web performance perspective, right? So if you manage to have the domain overall reply faster or respond faster to the request, then obviously you get more pages being processed. So it wouldn't make sense to cap it on a URL level. So essentially what you want is you want help Google to achieve more with less. So if we look at how crawl budget actually is being, or what crawl budget actually is, essentially we're talking about crawl rate times crawl demand, right? So taking crawl rate and crawl demand together, Google defines crawl budget as the number of URLs Google bot can and wants to crawl. What you need to understand is that crawl rate represents the number of simultaneous parallel connections that Google may use to crawl a site, right? And that means it's dynamic, because essentially it can go up if a site is very healthy, or it can go down or be capped if you, for example, have set crawl limitations in Search Console. And crawl demand, so even if crawl rate limit isn't being reached, but if there's no demand from indexing, so essentially no one is actually searching for it, there will be low activity from Googlebot, right? So, and that makes sense, right? Why would they refresh that if no one is actually searching for it? So you can think popularity, no links being added, or staleness, essentially nothing is going to change. Crawl rate really is not a single fixed number. That's very important. It can go up and down depending on the health. So taken from Google's kind of what they're saying about it is essentially if the site responds quickly for a while, this limit goes up, right? So if you essentially can prove that your site can deal with the load, then you actually get more. But on the other hand, if you can't manage, then Googlebot is going to be trying this nice citizen of the web, and the limit goes down, so they will essentially crawl less. So that means you need to really fix your crawling errors. That's super, super important. And crawl demand is essentially popularity and staleness, right? So for Google, if they think that something stays the same for a very long period of time, then they might not crawl it as often, and that's perfectly fine. That's normal. So don't worry about that. There's no sense in just changing some bits and pieces of content just for the sake of trying to make it look like that there's something going on. They will figure out anyhow, due to the fact that there's no search demand. There's a whole bunch of other factors in play. One is like the left hand shows the stuff that's in order of significance according to Google, right? So for certain navigation, we're going to talk about that, duplication, errors, etc., etc. So this, I think, is all quite well known. But I have some examples on the following slides. And in my mind, there's also some things more that they're not really talking about. The age of the domain plays a role, right? If you're there, you're very new, then you will potentially be not as trusted as. Content growth has a significant impact. If you try to put in like millions of URLs at once in the very beginning with a fresh domain, that's probably not going to work. However, if you have proven and you have had this content growth over time, well, then it's fine to add another 10,000 pages. If you have done that years and years and years, there's not going to be a cap. Priorities, so how it's going to be linked, accessibility, right? So do you waste let's say link equity by not linking directly, etc. So I leave you with this list. You can follow up on that later. There's also, just to clarify that, this is kind of the last theoretical slide, I would say, crawling versus indexing, because there's oftentimes confusion between the two things. So crawling essentially is the discovery process, right? So search engines send out their crawlers or their bots to find new as well as updated content, right? So this is what crawling really is, regardless of the format, and they try to discover it through links, through sitemaps, etc. On the other hand, indexing is where all those discovered pages are stored, right? So that means crawling needs to happen before it can be actually indexed. Essentially, indexing then is storing information into this huge, imagine a database. It's not really a database, but document storage in this case. I also put in a kind of a cheat sheet for you to follow up later. So just depending on what you want to achieve, there's various different ways on how to go and how to do that. So this is just for you to follow up, as well as which directive is actually gonna do what. It's very depending on the case. So I just thought it might be helpful if you want to follow up on that later. I mean, we have done a whole bunch of audits in the last years, as you can imagine. So I think most websites, from what we have seen, somehow suffer either indexing or crawling issues. So coming back to this, as I said, I picked kind of the e-commerce vertical and like a regular sized scope of 10 to 100,000 URLs. I would say like a mid-size e-com shop, so to say, just as an example, or I picked multiple ones, and I try to kind of put together 10 things that we have seen that kind of constantly go wrong, or where at least there's significant room of improvement, and that somewhat is tied into crawling or indexing. So I just thought it would be helpful, and I think you can adapt that also, because it's not only true for e-com, probably also true for other verticals. You can adapt that for your own need. So the first item that I constantly see that's not being dealt with properly is actually handling multiple versions of a product, right? So if you're selling something, oftentimes what obviously happens is that product exists multiple times. You know, that can be in different colors, they can be in different sizes, it can be both. So if we take an example, this one is taken from Nike. So they're selling a shoe called the Vaporfly for Flyknit. It's a running shoe, and obviously they have it in different colors, so red and blue. But what they do is they create for each of their shoes, not only for the colors, but also for the sizes, they create separate URLs. So you can imagine one shoe probably has easily 100 URLs per individual model. Take that times the models they are selling, you have a whole bunch of URLs that are being created. But, you know, essentially not enough people actually searching for something like the Nike Vaporfly for Flyknit in red and blue and whatnot. They usually just search for the model. So the demand is too low for those product detail pages to be indexed really. There's various solutions and fixes to it. If you can't do something different, then at least canonical tags can help. So you could canonicalize to the kind of strongest selling product, in this case, or strongest selling variant, probably is better said. So that means, you know, I don't know, the black one or the blue one in size 43 for men is the strongest one, and the rest canonicalizes over. You can still make it, selectable if you choose canonical tags, and I'm not the biggest fan. Let's just leave it with that. At least make sure you implement it properly. So one annotation, absolute URLs, no broken annotations, no chaining, etc. Because if you do that, then it's just guaranteed that Google is not gonna kind of obey that. So if you want to figure out if they do, there's on the right hand side, I mean, you can use the tool in Search Console, at least see if the Google selected canonical matches the one that you kind of set up. I think better way to do it is this taken from another company that produces shoes called Salomon, and what they do is they essentially have only one product detail page being indexed, and what they essentially do is they still have, of course, variants for sizes and colors and whatnot, but they solve it with the hashbang and then some parameters afterwards, because essentially that is not treated as a separate URL in this case. So that works really well for them. It improves crawl budget, and also those their product detail pages rank really strong. I understand, of course, if you search for a brand like Nike, they probably will always have the ranking. But I mean, if you adapt that to any other e-com, I think you understand it makes sense to kind of just consolidate product detail pages per one model, because people essentially are searching for that. The other thing is somewhat a bit into the same direction. It's again dealing with product pages, but if they are reachable through multiple categories, right? So I know it's still early, but I think Gin actually always works. So there's a website called Gin Kiosk, and what they have is, so one of my favorite German gins, actually Monkey 47. What they do is they have it in international gins, which makes sense, and then they have it in a category called most popular. But what they're doing is they're actually replicating their product detail pages. So the Monkey 47 product detail page exists twice, right? This is probably not a good idea, because it will be crawled twice, it will be indexed twice, but it will never be ranking as strong as it possibly could be if you would consolidate it. So make sure that if you have multiple categories that are serving the same products, that they don't exist multiple times. There's various solutions. So this is taken from a German retailer, but I mean, there's other ways as well. So Otto, what they do is they just kind of put all their products into one separate folder. It's oftentimes also easier, like for analyzers and whatnot, but I mean, up to you how you want to solve it. You could also just, you know, jump between the categories. You could use canonical tags for like the kind of secondary and tertiary categories, and then kind of canonicalize over. I would not recommend that, because again, then they still would need to be crawled and processed. So only having them existing once is probably the best idea. So let's also talk a bit about categories, why we already added or kind of an indexing strategy for categories. And there's oftentimes subcategories, there's pagination, and various different types of things. Actually, there's faceted navigation that was also mentioned by Google. We oftentimes have filtering. We have shopping baskets, wish lists, members areas, and a whole bunch of other things. And depending on your scope and volume, there can be really a lot of those different things, and of course also depending on the features of your kind of shop, really. And just a couple of examples of how to not do it, really. So this is taken from one of the, I think it's UK retailer, I can't even recall the name, but anyhow, if you look at sortings like this, and they create all separate URLs for these options, high to low, low to high, different types of filters. I mean, to be very honest, no one is ever going to use all of them anyways. So I think it's not necessarily even an SEO issue. However, they make it an SEO issue. But my starting point here would be to just work with your data team, have a look at analytics, try to understand if those are being used at all. Because if not, you can just eliminate them straight away anyways, and then you solve your SEO and crawling problems, in one sweep. And if for whatever reason they are still being used, or some, you can then kind of try to figure out and how to deal with it. So it could be then robots texted or not on a dedicated URL, etc. But like, try to see what those filters and sorting and whatnot is actually doing to your URL inventory, because oftentimes they are creating a tremendous amount of duplication internally. The same is true, and this is something that really drives me mad. I've never ever seen any of the shops that we've been working with in the past where people are actually using this feature. So it's a German screenshot, but what it says essentially, you can set up articles per page or items per page. People are lazy. There's a very, 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 very small amount of people, and that probably are the pros that actually are using this. But what I would recommend is go to your analytics, have a look if that's really being used, and I would say 9.5 times out of 10, no one's actually using that. So get rid of it. If you might have some people that are using it, then at least make sure that it's not being duplicated URLs again. Could be a client-side solution that you do there. I would generally go into the direction and do split testing to figure out what the best amount in terms of conversion rate is, the best amount of items to be shown, and then get rid of the options and just show them what works best in terms of the overall conversion rate. Pagination is a big topic. We could probably spend hours on this, so I'm not going to do that. But I just want to mention it here. There's various ways, and there's a great test which is linked in the deck, done by the guys from Audisto, which is kind of a crawling tool as well. And they, depending on what you want to achieve with your pagination, if you really need pagination, they kind of give you the perfect way of how to link, right? So do you link to the next page? Do you link the first 3 pages? Or do you link first 3 pages in page 10, etc.? So there's various ways of doing it. It really depends on what you need your pagination for. So this is something that you should investigate depending on your very own setup. Another thing mentioning pagination here, this is one of those classics that you see oftentimes when you do audits. This is a company called Tausendkind, and they are like a retailer as well. They have pagination in their store, so no surprise. But what they do is, if you paginate to page 2 and then you go back to page 1, they append this page equals 1 or p equals 1, which is their first page. So essentially they're duplicating their first page. They put it on no index, which is not great. So they're losing all their internal link equity, right? So if you have a page 1, make sure that this one really works without the parameter, and if there's a parameter being appended, you can redirect it or whatever, but don't have 2 versions of your page 1, one with and one without parameter. That's just, again, crawl waste. Faceted navigation is a big topic. Quick example here from Zalando. So faceted navigation, for those that are not familiar with the concept, essentially faceted search is a restriction of selection according to different properties. You could probably say that, right? So you can select the brand and the color, maybe for men's or women's or whatever you want to pick, and it's a combination, and then it creates a different set of results. If you would allow, and again for Zalando the same, if they would allow all of those to become crawlable URLs, that would lead to millions or probably billions of URLs at their scale. So that's really not really going to work. So I'm not saying faceted navigation cannot be used for SEO. I think that's not true either. But you need to be very, very cautious and very, very thorough with how you control it. So essentially what you would need if you want to deal with indexable faceted navigation, then you would need an option in your system somehow allowing you to only open up certain types of faceted navigation. So quick example for one of the retailers that we've been working with, we went even as far as, we understood that, of course, let's say dresses was one of the categories. Dresses make sense, and one of the faceted could be red dresses, green dresses, black dresses. But if you look at search demand, green and purple wouldn't even been searched for. So what we ended up doing is we kind of allowed an option in the system saying, okay, let's open the category and then let's open only certain faceted. So facets in this case, black and red, because there was search demand. The rest would land up or end up on the dresses category. So that can work really, really well. Boots, great example here. If you want to follow up on this, they do that all client side with JavaScript. That's really nicely done. So that's something that you can kind of play with. Or there's a concept called PRG, so post redirect get. It's a pattern that essentially ensures that Google can't crawl those URLs. It's essentially, the link looks like a link, but it's not a link. It's essentially another element, a button, something like this. And it sends a post request so that basically the crawler doesn't end up in the links. I mentioned URL parameters already. So essentially there is, of course, parameter settings in Search Console that you can use. You should be aware that obviously you're only doing this for Googlebot if you do it that way. I would rather recommend, if you need to deal with parameters and your system doesn't do that yet properly, you could use something like this, so that this parameter whitelisting, kind of a workflow how it can work. So essentially, only if a parameter is known to the system, you would allow this to be indexable or even be appended to the URL. And if not, what you would do is you would do either through your own redirect, or if it's some kind of malicious request, you could actually also serve a 403. In this case, you would ensure that that's not someone playing with your URL setup and just for the sake of doing it, appending URL parameters. Tracking is also a big thing in terms of parameters, so make sure that you are aware of how tracking is being used and what your team is potentially doing when they need to do campaign tracking. Don't use like get URLs, use the hashbang again. Don't link internally when you're tracking. So this is taken from Zoo Plus, which is like a retailer for like dogs and pet food in general. So they internally link their UTM parameters, which of course again creates a significant amount of duplication. So this is something you shouldn't be doing. And also last thing on tracking, on parameters, URL parameter order does really matter. So those two URLs essentially serve the same content, but if you can, as you can see, just the year parameter, the first example goes first and then the next one goes second. So that means it's two different URLs. Also very quickly touching on redirects, redirect chains. So redirect chains essentially is redirecting from A to B to C, but what you would want is you want to end up on C straight away. So that means essentially there's a hop in the middle that you don't want. So essentially you need to kind of clean up. This is taken from Deep Crawl, but they all have like, Screaming Frog, whatever you're using. They have something that's called the redirect chain report. Run a crawl, go through your site, eliminate the middleman, if you so will. So always when you have to redirect, go from the source to the destination, and then you're good to go. Also make sure that it's, sometimes when you set up redirects, then people start to be really lazy and they don't change the links in the source code. But what you want is actually the source code to be cleaned up and directly linked to destination. Otherwise, you would be losing link equity from A to B. So there's no sense in doing that really. And lastly on this, also make sure that you fix your 404s, especially the internally linked ones. I mean, if that goes up like crazy, this certainly can't be a good quality signal. All right, 3 more to go. We have 3 more minutes. I think that should be doable. Then we still have time for a bit of Q&A. Expired products, out of stock management is also an important thing. Don't do like what Marks and Spencer's does. So they don't really care about the inventory. It seems 233,000 URLs of products that are not on stock anymore. So understand there's a whole bunch of scenarios of how you can do with out of stock really, and what you can do. But understand what out of stock really means. So is it temporary? Is it permanent? Do you have a successor product? Do you have the same product in a different color? Do you have something that's relatedly similar? Do you have an internal site search that you can use? Again, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this. You have the flowchart, you can follow up on this. I would recommend that whatever you do, if you do any kind of automation, because something is out of stock, I would emphasize on informing your users. So like kind of a layer saying, well, this product is out of stock, but we kind of thought that this same product in black could potentially be the alternative. This is, by the way, also true for categories. So if you have high churn on categories where you need to deal with inventory coming and going, then make sure that you also deal with what's happening when a page 2 doesn't have any products, and make sure that your 301 redirect when you change category structure, right? This is super important. Otherwise, if categories are linked and they have external links, you lose link equity. You can test that relatively easy. There's a free tool called HTTP status.io. You can batch test, you can do multi-upload and download, really helpful. Quickly mentioning content quality, because that was also on the list. It plays a big role. So if you have stuff like this, right? So this is like a mobile phone case just for 2,400 different types of models. There's no sense in indexing 2,400 different products if they're essentially the same and just for a different smartphone. So really understand if there's a need to index things, and also make sure that you do not index, you know, feeded content, no result pages, poorly written content, etc. Even internal site search is something that I would not really index out of the box, because essentially this can go very, very wrong if people are indexing millions and millions of auto-generated pages at some point. Discovery, you know, sitemaps, just quickly mentioning this here because, you know, it should be there for the sake of completeness. Poorly maintained sitemaps are a big issue. So if you're using sitemaps and they're not generated by something like the WordPress plugin, which does it really nicely, then make sure that you only index URLs that are no redirects, that are not, you know, blocked by robots text or meta text or anything else. Easy way to do that, Screaming Frog, kind of import that, list crawl, and then see if they are all return 200s non-canonicalized, or, you know, in deep crawl with a deep crawl source gap. Either way works really. Last thing is web performance. As I said, sadly we can't go into that, but I'm sure you all are somewhat already aware of this kind of becoming a ranking factor, or let's say, you know, with Core Web Vitals, they're kind of pushing for, you know, evaluating user as well as page experience, right? There's 3 new metrics. There's a whole new things around measurement and whatnot. I have a pretty big checklist on my SlideShare account. So if you want to kind of poke around, see what you can and should be doing around web performance, I think that would be a good starting point. It certainly does also help your crawl and indexing budget. So yeah, I think this is something that you should be checking out as well. As I said, if you want the slides, because this was fast and a lot, I know, and it's not even 12. So hi@pa.ag is where you can reach the team. We're happy to share the slides. I'm also sure that the guys here are going to sharing them afterwards. So either way works. Just let me know. All right, and I think you made it through. Only 80 slides in roughly half an hour. So I think that's quite good. No?
That was certainly lightning speed, Bastian.
Getting there.
Awesome. Very, very interesting and valuable, I think. I think also our attendees are still kind of gathering their thoughts, because we currently do not have any questions, but I have a question for you, Bastian.
Shoot.
You, in the many hundreds of audits that you do of, let's say we qualify the websites like you did between, let's say 10,000 and 100,000 URLs, or 100,000 to 1 million URLs, or above 1 million URLs.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest leverage, if you say like the technical part of the website, the content part of the website, or the off-page part of the website? What is your experience? Yeah,
that's a funny topic, right? I mean, so there's I just had it. I think we're doing this Peak Ace on Air show, and we had a guest, actually James Brockman from Digital Loft. So Olivia just spoke before I saw, and so it was funny. We had kind of the same discussion around like what is it going to be, and like the example that I gave there was that basically. So I have one slide, and it looks very, very ugly, that I did 15 years ago actually when I still worked in-house, and it has like this. 3 cornerstones of SEO, and it's exactly what you're saying. So it's links, it's content, and it's tech, right? And I think what has changed, of course, is certainly the weighting of different attributes, right? So links were probably much more powerful back in the day. I'm not saying they're not powerful anymore, but like, you know, that might have changed to an extent depending on context. But I think, you know, for me, it's really like tech SEO as a core just needs to be done properly, right? You know, we have a team that does digital PR and link building and whatnot, and that's still super important and still very valuable. But like whatever they do, there will not be the kind of the most impact if the tech base is not done well, right? If that site is super slow, you can build like the greatest things in the world, that people don't want to interact with the site. That's not gonna work. Or, you know, the other way around, if you have millions of low quality pages in the index, you can point links to whatever you want, and some single pages might even rank better than before, but like the overall impact is much smaller than what it could be. So for me, I think tech SEO is a foundation that you just need to do regardless of what else you're doing. This is just kind of our take, really.
Yeah, that's how we usually approach it. Like, technical SEO is the basics. You need to have that covered. Otherwise, you're just compromising everything else you are investing in SEO and content and stuff. I just think logic and experience suggest that probably the bigger the site, the more opportunity for technical problems, and the bigger maybe is the leverage of the technical optimization, especially if nobody was giving any thought to it, and you have millions of false URLs and duplicate content and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
Okay, we got a question.
Yep.
Do I really care about crawling budget for a website that has less than 1,000 URLs?
No, probably not. I think this is also what I mentioned. There's a minimum chance that Google has any issues with that site, and I think that issues are usually then not related to crawl budget. It's something different. I mean, 1,000 URLs is being crawled in a heartbeat, to be honest. So no, I mean, crawling, no. Indexing potentially, because if you only have, let's say 10 valuable pages and you're creating 1,000 URLs, then that's more an indexing issue, but they will easily make it through the 1,000 URLs in terms of crawling. So from a crawling perspective, no. From an indexing perspective, I think I'm a huge fan, and I honestly or strongly believe it makes a difference, of maintaining a small set of high valuable landing pages or entry pages in the index, and the rest should at least not be indexed. This is my take. There's no sense in having 3 versions of something and a sorting and a printing view and all of this nonsense. These are not great entry pages. So no, but crawling for less than 1,000 URLs, I don't think that's going to be an issue with that.
Okay, just the last question, because the thing that you mentioned before, the 3 pillars of SEO, the technique, the content, and the off page. Would you agree that maybe the 4th has entered as an user experience on the website, as an SEO ranking factor, especially for the websites who want to rank top 3 position in Google search?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, I think UX, however you wanna describe it, really is something that certainly has gained much more significance in the last. I recall, I think I wrote the first article somewhere, or like gave an interview like 4 years ago on like initial kind of thoughts around that, and I would certainly agree that this is a layer that somewhat, I mean, it depends on where you put it, right? I mean, you could also say content, because content in this regard, if that content is not well done, it will somewhat impact UX directly, right? But if you look at kind of isolated levels, I think you could very much say UX, because it, as you said, it can be content. It also resides potentially in tech because of performance and somewhere else. Is certainly one big bucket that I would pay a lot of attention to for, especially for the top 5, top 3, because if UX doesn't work in those, there's literally no chance that you at least stay there for the long run, right? I mean, it doesn't say you can't get there and Google will test you, but if you're not performing as expected, then there's certainly going to be someone else that pops up and has a better UX. Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Bastian, for that and for the really exciting presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
Awesome. Then I guess I would be next.
You would be next. All right. So I'm switching off and I'll see you guys later.
Thanks. See you later at the Q&A.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yep.